I'm happy to be with you, with all the friends around the world, and share some knowledge we have for the time being about the sacred Tetragrammaton, the name of God in the Bible. What is the new? What can we learn about the Tetragrammaton? We will start from our sources. The Bible defines the God. The Bible, especially the Hebrew scriptures, what is called by the majority of Christians the Old Testament. The Tetragrammaton is the name of the true God. Only the true God can have this name according to the Bible. In the Septuagint version of Jeremiah 32:18, we read about Lord Jehovah, that is, the one with a great name. He is the one that has this great name, and only he in the Hebrew scriptures, the true God. Regarding the term God, the Bible, especially the Hebrew part of it, it is used, the term Elohim, to describe other persons as well. For example, divine or godlike beings as faithful angels or rebellious angels, and especially in the New Testament, the Christian Greek scriptures, God's Son, Jesus himself, the Word. Also, human beings are described as gods in the Old and the New Testament: kings, judges, presumptuous individuals, and God's representatives. We have to make clear here that the Greek term theos and the Hebrew term Elohim, Eloah Elohim, is not semantically, that is, in their meaning, the same. They only partly overlap semantically. While the term Lord is used, can be used for any of these persons that I just mentioned. But what's in the name itself, the Tetragrammaton? What can we say about this name? What is the meaning of the name? There are many approaches and many answers. First of all, what is the root that is used in this name? What is the verb that is used in this verb? What is the relation of the name Jehovah or Yahweh or Yehovah, as is the older Latin and Greek traditional pronunciation in our modern times? What is the relation of this name with Exodus 3:14 about the explanation that God himself gives about himself? Is it the Hebrew kal or the Hebrew hifil? Different tenses, let's say, that in the translational history follow different ways. This changes what meaning is given to God's name. What is the relation between be and become? The answers that we give in these questions make us understand God's name in one way or another. So I use one source that says that from Exodus 3:14 we have at least three general understandings of God's name. I am he who alone has the fullness of being and who gives being to all others. I am, the second one, I am he who always will be and therefore will be faithful to Israel. And the third one, I am the one who cannot be known due to my transcendence. In the history of attempting to understand God's name, at least these basic understandings have been in the front line. But as for us, we would say that it is fair enough to say that the understanding that Ben Sasson and others, of course, describe as an fair and acceptable meaning of God's name is the one who causes to become, the one who causes to become. we wouldn't say more than this because our emphasis in this presentation is in the Bible, in the scriptures in the Bible. We must remember that one way or another, the proper name of God never ceased from use. This is very important to remember, not only in written form, but also in pronunciation. The name of God did never stop being pronounced. The latest article of edition of the National Geographic has a cover with Dead Sea Scroll. In it, at least 5 times appears the Tetragrammaton in Paleo-Hebrew script. That is not something that happened by luck, but people want to learn more about this name, and the use of the sacred Tetragrammaton in Paleo-Hebrew script in the Dead Sea Scrolls is the oldest manuscripts that we have in our hands that use the name of God, the oldest copies of the Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament. Here is Psalm 138 that uses many times, 8 times, the Tetragrammaton, as you can see, in Paleo-Hebrew script, the older Hebrew script. But we have many manuscripts of the Hebrew scriptures. Nehemiah Gordon counted more than 2,044 manuscripts, vocalized manuscripts with vowel signs of the Hebrew scriptures. Here we see the Damascus scroll here of the 13th century, vocalized. Here we can see the Aleppo Codex of the book of Isaiah. But it's important to remember what Zerar Zertu in his book mentions, that the oldest Hebrew manuscripts that do not have a standard way of writing the vowels within the Tetragrammaton. So you can see here the oldest manuscripts. We have the Kethiv, the thing that is written in the manuscript, and the Kere is these vocalic signs that are not standard among these ancient, most ancient manuscripts. It's not, they haven't been yet standardized, as happened in the latest copies of the Hebrew scriptures. This is important because in encyclopedias, in Wikipedia, in other sources, we easily read that all the manuscripts follow a specific way of vocalization. This is not true. Here we see a beautiful manuscript, a page from the King's Bible, a Spanish Hebrew Bible from the Spanish Catalonia, that was written by the end of the 14th century. This is an ornamented Tetragrammaton, really beautiful indeed. But a major question that we have to answer before we continue in our discussion is the first Greek translation, the so-called Septuagint. Did Septuagint include the Tetragrammaton, the first Greek translation? This translation was made from the early 3rd century BCE until the 2nd century BCE, and some books that were originally written in Greek and were added to the canon of the Septuagint were even later written. Issues for clarification and examination regarding this question are these. What is Septuagint? When we talk about Septuagint, what do we mean? Septuagint means the translation, this translation, earliest Greek translation in Christian tradition. If we want to refer to the original Jewish translation, we use the term Old Greek. What was originally translated? We must remember that only the Pentateuch was translated from Hebrew to Greek. After that, the rest of the books were also translated. Questions that also we have to ask is, did all copiers of this original translation retain the original forms or terms of the divine name and of other titles? Did all translators before the copiers uniformly render the Tetragrammaton? And even more, did all authors use similarly the Tetragrammaton in their texts? In these questions, we have very interesting answers. Regarding the Greek translation, we must remember, as is in here, that there isn't one translation, a Septuagint translation that came from us from the 3rd century BC. No. Very few manuscripts are similar between them. We now, I mean, the latest centuries, we see that there were various Greek recensions, Proto-Lucianic, Hesychian, Hebraizing Hexaplaric, Hebraizing Kaigye, and also later important Jewish Greek versions like Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion that attempted to correct the original Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. So we do not speak about a monolith, that this was the old Greek translation. We speak about a tradition of translations of the Hebrew scriptures, the older one that was made in Alexandria, but even in the next day of this translation, recensions and revisions and new translations in Greek of the Hebrew text. Regarding the last question we asked here, did all authors of the Bible books use similarly the Tetragrammaton? It's interesting to say that here we see the 6,828 instances of the Tetragrammaton within the Hebrew scriptures according to each book. So we see every book, how many times in every book appears the name of God. But a better question would be how many times the author of every book uses the name in the total of the words that he writes down, the words that he wrote down in the text we have. So we see other conclusions. We can have other conclusions if we make this question. So we can see that in the book of Psalms and the book of Jeremiah, we have the top use of the Tetragrammaton in total in these books. But if we see in this table, we see that Deuteronomy has almost 14 times the Tetragrammaton in every 100 words. That means in this book, and also in the book of Jeremiah as well, we have the top, and also the book of Haggai, we have the biggest use, the greatest use of the Tetragrammaton by the author of this book. And of course, we must remember that there are books that do not use the sacred Tetragrammaton. In the Old Testament, the book of Esther, Ecclesiastes, and Canticles. And for the translations of the New Testament that use the Tetragrammaton in their texts, there are also in the New Testament books, in the Christian Greek scriptures, that do not have, the authors do not use the name of God in their texts. This is interesting to remember. Also, we must remember that there are parts of the Bible that they make a very dense use of the Tetragrammaton, very dense use of God's name. For example, Psalm 29, you see in the Jerusalem Bible translation, almost in every line, we have God's name. What about the manuscripts? In the Greek manuscripts of the Septuagint, we have a variety of scribal practices. What we see here, let me make this change for a minute. Excuse me for a minute. We see here the most ancient manuscripts, copies of the Septuagint translation. We see a manuscript from the 1st century BCE. This is it. It uses a Greek word, the word iao, as a rendering of the yod, he, vav, he in Greek. It says endolon iao. It's a verse from the book of Leviticus. We have other manuscripts that follows in the middle of the 1st century BCE that uses the name of God in square Aramaic script. Then follows manuscripts that are from Jesus' era and his apostles in Paleo-Hebrew. Here we see the book of Zechariah that uses the Tetragrammaton within the Greek text in Paleo-Hebrew script. In the book of Job, we are in the early 1st century CE. We are here in about the early 2nd century, and even here in the end of the 3rd century, that we have forms of the Tetragrammaton with Paleo-Hebrew scripts. Here, it's interesting to see that the term theos is not abbreviated. It's not in form of nomina sacra, as we say, as it is here. Here we see theta and sigma, thusu, theos, but it's abbreviated. As also the Tetragrammaton is abbreviated with 2 Paleo-Hebrew yod here, although it's not very clear in this photograph. So it's important to keep in our minds that theos is not abbreviated. So the older available Septuagint manuscripts we have in our days from the 1st century BC to the late 3rd century CE do not use the term Lord, that is kurios in Greek, but the form of the Tetragrammaton, either a transliteration like iao, an Aramaic script, or in a Paleo-Hebrew script, Tetragrammaton, or a Tetragrammaton, as we said, in an abbreviated form. But how did the transition happen from the Tetragrammaton to the Greek Kyrios within the copies of the older Greek translations of the Old Testament? We must remember, regarding Judaism, that this was a period of Hellenization of Palestine and also of the diaspora. Regarding Christianity, from the middle of the 1st century CE and on, we see the transformation of a Jewish messianic sect to an ecumenical movement that included people that didn't have a good grasp of the Hebrew scriptures, of how God is described in Hebrew scriptures. And also a very important factor and a decisive role was the one that was played by the scribes, the scribal factor. As Hurtado says, the nomina sacra, that is the replacement the Tetragrammaton by Kyrios in an abbreviated form, as you can see here in the Codex Vaticanus, here, Kappa Sigma, λέγει Kyrios Pantocrator. The nomina sacra were intended to register religious devotion visually. It's a textual phenomenon, and also it's a scribal convention that took place among Christians when they were copying the Old Testament manuscripts for themselves. But surely we must remember, as Cole says, that we must make it clear that it's not true that all Septuagint manuscripts of the Common Era must be Christian, as the Jews supposedly abandoned Septuagint as a translation. Or we must not consider as truth that the use of nomina sacra can only be Christian. So in these early times, what is Christian, what is Jewish Christian, and what is Jewish is not so easily discernible. And today we must be more cautious when we say that this is Jewish manuscript or it's a Christian manuscript. Origen, this great Christian exegete and Bible scholar, said that in his time, among the manuscripts, there was great discrepancy that was caused by the copyists and the correctors and the scribes. And these ones, they added or took away whatever they decided when they were correcting the text of the Bible. And that he attempted to fix this discrepancy in the manuscripts of the Old Testament by comparing all the good available translations, Greek translations of the Hebrew scriptures of his times. And this will be the hexapla that we'll discuss following. But first of all, we must say what are the major reasons for the silencing of the divine name. Why the divine name stopped from being pronounced among the people. One reason was that the Greek philosophical notions and patterns of thought heavily influenced and transformed fundamental biblical conceptions. Greek philosophy changed the way that someone could understand the Bible. The enforced Hellenization of the Palestine Jews changed their understanding of their traditional understanding of the Bible. Syncretistic and Gnostic theological interpretations were also added. The development of exclusivistic or elitistic mentalities, as Josephus, for example, that says, I know how the Tetragrammaton is pronounced, but it's not allowed to me to tell you what is the exact pronunciation, because he himself belonged to a priestly family. So this was an exclusivistic understanding of God's name. Also, the religious magical practices that abound at that time, made the Jews not to want to use the Tetragrammaton, to pronounce God's name. And also the increased sense of moral degradation. So the sinners were more than the pious ones. So that was the reason, as many Jews believed, that the name should be not pronounced. These are some major reasons that made the name of God to be silenced among mainly Jewish people. But also this followed in the Christian communities, especially out of Palestine. As this abbreviation, the nomen sacrum, the nomina sacra, and especially the Kyrios nomen sacrum appeared, we see some interesting phenomena in the Bible manuscripts. For example, what's happening when there is the Hebrew expression Adonai Elohim, that is, the phrase Adonai Yehovah, how is translated in Greek? We see here that in this transitional time, they used Kyrios Kyrios or Adonai Kyrios as a rendering Kyrios for the Tetragrammaton, and again Kyrios or Adonai for Adonai. So this was a bit funny to read Tade legi Kyrios Kyrios. This is the thing that Lord, Lord says. So in some manuscripts, it was a great need to explain that when you see Kyrios, it is the Tetragrammaton that is meant. Even Origen himself says that Lord is used here instead of Iao. He writes on a comment on 2nd Psalm, verse 4. And in many manuscripts, and as we will see in the following, it was to be a marginal explanation that when you see Kyrios in the text, the Tetragrammaton should be replaced there. So this was the time that the Tetragrammaton was taken out from the Bible text, and Kyrios was added, was put in its place. This case remains the same in our days, as we can compare some translations, for example, in the verse Amos 3 chapter and verse 11 that says Adonai Yehovah. The Septuagint says Kyrios o Theos, the Lord God. We see that the majority of translations use the phrase Lord God. Lord God with capital, with no capitals except the initial one. Lord with capitals, all capitals. And sovereign Lord with all small capitals. Only two translations, the Jerusalem Bible and the New World Translation, use a name for a name in the Hebrew scripture. And we must keep it in mind that here a name is used. And Nico Dams, a Bible scholar writing an article in the journal, the Bible Translator of the United Bible Societies, says that the first thing translators would need to do is to represent this name, the Tetragrammaton, as a distinct name, thereby indicating that it is truly a unique name of God with a specific meaning, and not to replace it with lordship notions. So a good translation should use a name in place of the Tetragrammaton, which is a name. Lord is not a name, it's a title that is used. The Greek kurios has been used in the later copies of the Septuagint to render the Tetragrammaton, but it has no semantic relation with the Hebrew Tetragrammaton. We must keep it in mind. So, what was the work of Origen? What he actually did? In the middle of the 3rd century, Origen in Caesarea of Palestine made an edition of parallel versions of text of the Old Testaments that had 6 columns. The first one had the Hebrew text. The second one had the transliteration of the Hebrew text into Greek. The third column had the Greek translation that was made by Aquila. The fourth one that was made, the translation made by Symmachus. The fifth one, the Septuagint translation that was made before Origen's time. And the sixth column, that it was the revision made by the Theodotion. And also in some parts there were other 3 translations that are mentioned and used by Origen. So he put in columns all the good available translations of his time and offered to the researchers the ability to compare these different translations and the original, the best original text of his times. Why is this so important for us today? The Tetragrammaton was included in Exapla in all Greek versions that were used by Origen. That is very, very important to remember. Here we see the translations that were used by Origen, but not within the Hexapla form. It is copies that we have before the Hexapla, the original translations before they were put in this columnar style by Origen. We see that all the available manuscripts we have use, here we see Aquila's translations, Symmachus translations, and Aquila's translations. We have more copies because it was used more than all the other translations. We see that all of them use Paleo-Hebrew script when the Tetragrammaton appears in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And again, we see here that there is no abbreviation of the term theos. You see here, here, and here, theou. So at that time, it was not used the abbreviated forms like the nomina sacra that were later common among the Christian copies. This is something important to also keep in our minds. So these translations originally had the Paleo-Hebrew form of the Tetragrammaton. When Origen made this columnar, as you can see at the top here, 6-volume edition of his Hexapla, and this is the oldest copy we have, probably first level copy of the Origen's Hexapla. Also, we see that the Tetragrammaton is used, but now not in Paleo-Hebrew script, but in the Aramaic square script. This is a copy from the 7th century, really old indeed, copy of the Hexapla. And here is the Septuagint column of the Tetragrammaton that includes the Tetragrammaton. Here we see the Taylor transcription of the text. We see that Aquila, Symmachus, and the Septuagint use the Tetragrammaton. The common form for the Yod He Vav He was the PP, as was written by the scribes that they weren't acquainted with the Hebrew script. Here we see a copy from the Hebrew column, from the second column, that is the Hebrew transcribed in Greek of the Hexapla. Here we see also Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion that use the Tetragrammaton, that the scribe attempted his best and wrote it this way. Another Tetragrammaton, as we can see in this manuscript of 8th to 10th century C. We see here that in all columns the Tetragrammaton appears. The same is here. In this manuscript, we can see a tilde that says that when you see Kyrios in this abbreviated form, Aquila and Symmachus says Yehovah ο Θεός, and Theodotion says Adonai Yehovah. So the reader could know in the text that it's not Adonai in the Hebrew text, it's the Tetragrammaton. Also, there were the Greek rendering of Yah, of the Jah, followed by the Tetragrammaton, as appears in the book of Isaiah, 12th chapter and verse 2. Also in another, we see in the Aquila's version, in another manuscripts from the 11th century. And here we see a very rare and very important manuscript. It's Codex Ambrosianus, MSO 39, that uses, we can see here, that uses the Tetragrammaton in all the columns. And this is the column of the Septuagint. It's important to see that in the column of Septuagint, there is here and here the nomen sacrum kappa sigma, Kyrios. And here we see a tilde that says, it has a kappa that says that when you see the Tetragrammaton, we mean Kyrios. So probably Origen was trying to explain that in some copies, in some manuscripts, you may find the Kyrios, but originally here should be the Tetragrammaton. And this tradition of explaining where is the Tetragrammaton in the Greek text, according to the Hebrew text, followed and was copied for many centuries. This is also very important to remember. And we will add it in the conclusions that will follow. So, in the Hexapla edition, all the columns that included the Tetragrammaton were written in square Aramaic script, as you can see here and in all the cases we already mentioned. Origen, in a comment on the book of Ezekiel, 8th chapter and verse 1, says that when you see Kyrios, Kyrios, you should know that with Kyrios, the respectful name of, in Hebrew, of God is implied. The proper name of God is implied. But also the second Kyrios, the Adonai, means the other Kyrios. The first and the second, one is Adonai and the other is the Tetragrammaton. So the Greek readers of Origen, and not only Origen, of Eusebius and other Christian fathers and authors of the Antiochian school, Christian school, for centuries made reference to this distinction among Adonai and the Tetragrammaton for the Greek speakers and the Syriac speakers as well. And also Hieronymus made also some comments on this in Latin. So also the Latin audience would know this difference. So if we would attempt it to see how was this transition took place, we can say that, as Emmanuel Tov says, originally in Alexandria, the translators of the Septuagint used a form that was in Greek, as it was transcribed, it was transliterated as any other name with no special differentiation. It was Iao, most probably, as the most ancient copy of the Septuagint provides evidence for us. Then the Tetragrammaton appeared in Aramaic script or in Paleo-Hebrew script. Then this Aramaic square script became the Greek PP, as they look very similar. And then this PP was replaced by Kyrios as a nomen sacrum in a reverential way, mainly for the ones that weren't, they didn't know the Hebrew scriptures, and the Tetragrammaton for them was an exotic fruit. So, it's interesting that in a manuscript like Codex Markallianus of the 6th century, 400 times in the margin, it says, when you see Kyrios, kappa sigma, then here is meant the Tetragrammaton, the Tetragrammaton, the Tetragrammaton, the Tetragrammaton, 400 times. This is very important that this scribe of this manuscript considered very important to make clear to to the reader of the manuscript that here we have this name of God originally in the Hebrew scriptures, and they keep it also for the Greek audience, for the Greek readers. Pietersma, in a recent translation of Psalm, says, on the one hand, Kyrios glosses the Hebrew Tetragrammaton, and on the other hand, it translates the divine name Adonai. So we have a fanciful translation of, O Lord, our Lord, how admirable, and so on. That is not a precise translation of the Hebrew original, as you would agree with me. This tradition of the hexapla that for centuries made clear that all the Greek translations of the Old Testament included the Tetragrammaton, all the Greek translations of the Old Testament included the Tetragrammaton for all the early centuries CE. This tradition was also transmitted to the Syriac-speaking congregations. Already from the second century, there was a translation of the Hebrew scriptures in Syriac language, and soon after that, the New Testament were also translated in Syriac. Here we see from manuscripts of the early 8th century that says, with this tilde here, that the term Maria is corresponding to the PP. Here says PP, like the Greek PP, that is Yod He, Vav He, written in a simple Greek way, let's say. Another manuscript, Syroexaplaris Ambrosianus, here says that with the tilde again, when you see Maria, that is a special form of Kyrios, not just a Mar or a Marie form, but Maria. When you see Maria, we mean here the Hebrew Tetragrammaton, although it's Yod He, not Yod He, Vav He, because it was a transliteration of PP, that Yod and Vav seemed very similar between them. So in the Christian-speaking Christians, also it was clear when in the text was meant to be the Tetragrammaton. And as we will see below, this was clear also in the New Testament text as well. This is the tilde here, and this is the marginal note that made it clear. We must remember that virtually all Greek, Hebrew Bible or Old Testament copies during last centuries BC and early centuries CE included the Tetragrammaton. We must remember that the Tetragrammaton was ceaselessly copied and in permanent use and reference for many centuries by and among Christians. And therefore Christians, especially scholars of the Bible, were familiar with the Greek, Hebrew, and Syriac and Latin forms of the Tetragrammaton, as is evidenced by the available manuscripts that survived until our days. All these forms of the Tetragrammaton, in Greek mainly, prepared the way for the numerous Latin reconstructions of the Hebrew theonym that appeared since the early 2nd millennium CE. Another source that helps us understand that the name was not did not disappear among Christians were the sacred onomastica. Let's say dictionaries, small dictionaries that included names, and given the name in Greek of the Hebrew character and its meaning in Greek. And in this onomastica, again and again, Iao or Io is used, as you can see, and it's clear that these Hebrew names included the Tetragrammaton within them. They were theophoric names, And the Greek audience and the Latin audience as well knew that a form of the Tetragrammaton was included in the name. Forms like Iao, Iua, Ieua, Ioa were very similar and were attempting to transcribe in Greek the Hebrew term, the Hebrew Tetragrammaton. In many encyclopedias, we read that we don't use the Tetragrammaton. The Christians should not use the Tetragrammaton because of reverence for the Jewish tradition, because Jews do not use the Tetragrammaton according to their tradition. But what is that tradition? What do we mean when we say the Jewish tradition of not pronouncing, of not uttering the divine name? Actually, we have three sources that make reference to not pronouncing the divine name. The one is in the oldest part of what was the Talmud as we know it. It's the Mishnah. It was composed in the beginning of the 3rd century CE. Here says that these have no share in the world to come, this and that. And Abba Saul says, also one who utters the divine name as it is spelled, or another translation says, according to its letters. So we read that in the early 3rd century, or a little bit before that, a rabbi said this. It was a rabbi's understanding of who will not have a share in the future world, in the kingdom to come, the one who utters the divine name. Also, Rabbi Nachman Bar Yitzhak says the same. Says in this world the name is written with Yud and He, but pronounced with Aleph and Aleph. It's written that is meant Yod He Vav He, but it's read Aleph and Aleph Adonai. In the next world, it will be both written and pronounced with Yud He. It will be written and pronounced as Yehovah, that is. Not as I am written, am I called. I am written as Yehovah, but pronounced as Adonai. This is another tradition coming from the 6th century in the Talmud. And also another reference in the Talmud that says that it goes back to even 700 years in the past. It says that the priests refrained, after the death of Simeon the Righteous, refrained from blessing the Jewish people with the explicit name of God in the priestly blessing. So based on these three traditions that two rabbis, and some priests of that time said so, so all the later generations of Jews do not pronounce the Tetragrammaton. What do you say? What do you think? Would Jesus agree if it was in its time, to a degree, as we have reasons to believe so? Some people already did not pronounce God's name. Would Jesus follow such a human-made law? We know Jesus' opinion for other things. We know also, we can be sure that in this case would also disagree with such a human-made understanding. So this understanding of reverence for the Jewish tradition, we must remember that it was just a tradition of some rabbis and nothing more than that. Some say that in the Bible, in the Septuagint version of Leviticus 14th chapter, as was the rendering in the Greek translation, it said in verse 16th that the ones who names the name of Yehovah should be killed. And the same is written in the next, no, not in the same, in the second part of the same verse. When someone would call the name of Jehovah should put to death. But it's just to name the name or to pronounce the name the reason for someone to be put to death. If we see in the context, we can see that it's not when it says to pronounce the name or to name the name, means actually κατηράσατο, καταρασάμενον, καταράσιτε Θεόν, καταρασάμενον, means that he was not just naming, pronouncing the name, but cursing or reviling the name. So that's what was really meant in these verses. Not just to pronounce the name, but to curse or revile using the name. So this is another false understanding of this tradition of not pronouncing the divine name. If we try to make a timeline of what happened to the Tetragrammaton, we would say something like that, although some of that we will mention, of the phases that we will mention, overlapped with others. First, it seems that we are sure from the ancient times and during the first temple period, there was a widespread daily use of the divine name. It was freely used in every day, and not just in the temple. Everyone, everywhere could use the Tetragrammaton. The sacred name of God could be freely used and heard. It seems that the Samaritan prohibition to use the name came sometime in BC era. A Jewish response to Samaritans requiring greetings in the name shows that originally the Jews didn't accept this Samaritan prohibition. But afterwards, a limitation, especially by Pharisees, was invented for using the name only in the temple. Then also the Essene prohibition to use the name at all, as it appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls, came to be. Then followed the rabbinic ban on using the name because of its use in magic, and then followed the complete prohibition on publicly uttering the name, that this seems to have happened about the 2nd century CE. So such would be a timeline of not pronouncing the divine name among the Jews, and of course among the Christians that followed the Jews in this term. The Jewish communities here we see in 300 CE and in 600 CE, the Jewish communities, we see here that in some places, the Jewish communities disappeared, but they were also dispersed all over Mediterranean Sea and other places in Arabia, in Africa, and so on. We must keep in mind that especially here in the Minor Asia and the Greek area of the Roman Empire, the Greek-speaking area, the Eastern Roman Empire, was rich in Jewish populations, and also came to be the same in the Spanish Peninsula. Why we say this about the Jewish populations? Because a very interesting translation, medieval Greek translation of the Old Testament, came to be written and survived in our days in Grecus Venetus, a translation that was made in the 2nd half of the 14th century CE. In this translation, the Tetragrammaton is rendered in Greek as ondotis, ondurgos, and usiotis. The meaning of all these three terms is maker of beings, or the giver of essence, is given as a meaning of the Tetragrammaton in the Greek language. We see that the nomen sacrum Theos is is also used. Who made this translation? This seems to be a remain of the Biblia Triglotta that was probably made by the Constantinopolitan humanist scholar Simon Atoumano, an earlier monk and scribe that was later the bishop of Hierakas in Calabria, South Italy, in the mid-14th century, and the Latin archbishop of Thebes in the central Greek, in the end of the 14th century. He translated partly, at least, the Old Testament in Greek and Latin from Hebrew, and also the New Testament in Hebrew and Latin from Greek. But sadly enough, it probably did not survive until today, the New Testament. But the Old Testament is here, and it's very important to see that not only the name is pronounced and is not translated as Kurios or Kyrios, but it's also translated with a meaningful way, an attempt to understand what is behind the Hebrew Tetragrammaton. This is a very, very important translation, medieval translation of the Hebrew scriptures. Another translation is the so-called Constantinople Pentateuch, written in the middle of the 16th century. As you can see, here, the Tetragrammaton is written as Kyrios, Kyrios. In Alzamiado, as it is said, that is written with Hebrew letters, Greek words written with Hebrew letters. And it's very interesting that in Exodus 3:14, it is translates the Echech Aser Echech as Naime os Naime. Here, na ime os na ime. So you can see also here the Greek transcription, ο Εϊέ says so. Και είπεν ο Θεός προς τον Μωσέ, να είμαι ως να είμαι. Και είπεν, έτσι να πεις των παιδιών του Ισραήλ, ο Εϊέ με απέστειλεν προς εσάς. What a sweet translation indeed. Also a very important translation, also the Tetragrammaton is rendered with Kyrios. It's very important to see that another understanding, and not the Septuagintal understanding of on, that is the true being, the Platonic understanding of God implied behind this translation, is used here. No, the meaning is, I will be who I will be. I will prove to be who I will prove to be. I will show who I will be truly in my own acts in the future. Afterwards, Greek translations of the Old Testament followed. You see here forms in Greek, Yehovah, 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 Yahweh. You see that the start was mainly with vowels, and consonants were added in time, like gamma, that in ancient Greek, gamma was not gu, it was gu. Who was not soft, who, but it was hard. So it wouldn't be correct to say Gehova. When these consonants were softened, we could say Yehovah. It would be close to the Hebrew understanding and pronunciation of the Tetragrammaton. But the story, of course, wasn't so easily accepted from people that for many centuries were used to see the Lord in their translations of the Bible. So we see here from the modern Greek translations, the oldest translation of the Old Testament in modern Greek, made by Vamvas, we see that in the first version, in 1831, he used Yehovah, at least in one verse in Psalms. It was only the Psalms translated then. In the second edition, next year, also was kept Yehovah with other changes in the text. But after 3 years, it was replaced by Kyrios, but was retained in Exodus 6, chapter 3 verse. So we see that it wasn't easily accepted a form of the Tetragrammaton, a pronounceable force of the Tetragrammaton within a translation. But bold people like Vamvas did it. They included the name of God translated in Greek. Here we see that other Greek literature also made reference to the PP or the Yod-He, Vav-He. For the centuries that followed, we see copies from the 8th century to the 16th century that make mention of the Tetragrammaton. I'm aiming to say that it was not only in Bible translations, but also in other literature. We can count more than 100 different forms in Greek. You can visit here the Academia page and see these forms, attempts to render the Hebrew term in Greek in a pronounceable way. Many attempts in a 2,000 years spanning literary corpus, the Greek literature corpus. If we want to put in a timeline all these Greek renderings, we would see that as early as the 1st centuries CE, mainly vocalic, only using vowels, that is, renderings were used. Then times of ignorance follow, as Professor Wilkinson characterizes these centuries. Then a Yehavah appears, as we will see in the next, in the following images. And afterwards, from the 16th century and so, we see many other renderings: Yehovah, Yovahos, Yehvah, Yehvah, Yehovah, Yehovas, Yahovas, Yahveh, Yavo, Yahveh, Yahveh, Yeveh. All of them attempts to render the Tetragrammaton in Greek. Many of them were followed Latin renderings, although, as we already said, here we see a manuscript from the late 13th century in Greek that says Yehavah. It's very close to the oldest Latin we have from Raymond Martini that uses the form Yohwah or Yehovah, and also Porcetus de Salvatikis from the same era. So we see Yehavah, Yehovah, Yehovah, attempts, 3-syllable attempts, not 2-syllable attempts as Yahweh or Yahweh. These are 3 syllables here, restorations or renderings of the Tetragrammaton. Here we see the Yehavahs already mentioned by Nikolaos Idrundinos in the South Italy in a dialogue against Jews. We see the most probably ancient instance of Yehovah, as you can see here, by Martin Crucius in his Compendium Theologiae, rendering the Latin Yehovah with Yehovah in Greek. Then the Patriarch of Alexandria, Cyril III, Lucaris, in the first book that was published in Greek in the printery, in the first Greek printery in Constantinople in the early 17th century, used the form Yehovah, as you can see here, and also the form Yehovah that first seems to appear in the Orthodox Confession of Faith of the Catholic and Apostolic Church of the East, that was accepted to different degrees among all the Eastern Orthodox churches. Yehovah in the mid and late 17th century, and these are the manuscripts that are mentioned and use these forms of the Tetragrammaton. Other translators followed the traditional way of the Septuagint when it was in the Christian tradition, in the late Christian tradition, and they didn't use the Tetragrammaton or anything like that. Here we see the Ferrara Bible, a Jewish translation from the Hebrew into Ladino, the Spanish Jewish language, that uses the A, capital A with 2 points. That means Adonai. So no Tetragrammaton, no translation of the Tetragrammaton, but the initial letter of Adonai. Also, the famous Catholic Douay Rheims Bible in the early 17th century says, and my name in Exodus 6, 3rd verse, my name Adonai, I did not shew them. And says in the margin, Adonai is not the name here uttered to Moses, but is read in place of the unknown name. So we don't know the name. So there were traditions that said that we don't know the name. But other traditions as well that were saying that we know the name. And such a tradition was the one made by the Dominican friar and biblical scholar Sandes Pagnino in Latin, that used everywhere that the original text has the Tetragrammaton, he used the Yehovah form everywhere in the 1,000 times that appear in the original text. The same happened in the Jerusalem Bible in the 20th century. The same happened with the Spanish theologian Casiodoro de Reina, who used also the Yehovah rendering in all the places where in the original Hebrew was used. And in his introduction of the translation, Casiodoro de Reina, this Spanish Roman Catholic Hieronymite monk that was later converted to Lutheranism and lastly condemned as a heresiarch, he wrote in his introduction of his translation that we must say that even today is his translation is the most widely read among the Spanish-speaking people. He says that we have retained the name Jehovah for important reasons. First, because wherever it appears in our version, it is there in the Hebrew text, and we did not think we could leave it out or replace it with another name. In the case of the name Jehovah, previous practice has been precisely to both remove and add, by removing the name Jehovah and adding Lord or God in its place. While the reference is unchanged, the context and sense are changed significantly. And if you change the text, he says, Casiodoro de Reina, if you change the text, then is as if you said that the Spirit had made a mistake every time that used the Tetragrammaton. And now I'm coming and I'm changing this and I use the Lord instead of the Tetragrammaton. He said boldly that the superstition of modern rabbis arose this law of not pronouncing, of not translating the Tetragrammaton, and it was inspired by the devil. The 70 falsified the text by consistently replacing Jehovah with Lord, suppressing the sacred name completely. Now consider if it is right for this superstition to be perpetuated, or whether it should cease. Now God has given greater understanding. And all these are written in 1569. He also makes a comment for Jesus, why Jesus did not change the manuscripts of the Bible. And he says that this was not the work of Jesus when he came on earth. He was to preach the good news, not to correct the manuscripts. An interesting comment made by De Reina. So he was bold enough to use it, and for centuries the Spanish-speaking people to have the Jehovah form of the name within their copies of the Bible. And truly, Jehovah is the English translation par excellence, the most important form of the Tetragrammaton in English and other, of course, languages. If we make an n-gram search in the Google, we will see that no other form of the Tetragrammaton can be compared with the use of the form Jehovah. Jehovah indeed is the most used form of the Tetragrammaton for many centuries, and no other form, whatever the reason for that, cannot compare to this form. Is this the correct form? No one can say for sure, but surely is an acceptable form, and there are many sources that say that we can use safely this form. There are quite reasonable argumentations for that. We can use safely Jehovah, or if someone prefers another term, it's okay. If he believes that it's better rendering the Hebrew text, it's okay to use it, but it's important to use a proper name than a title instead of the Tetragrammaton. And here you see a butterfly that her name was given, in the name that was given to this beautiful butterfly, Jehovah was also included. Copiopteryx Jehovah is called this beautiful butterfly. We must remember this. The New Testament implies the use of the Tetragrammaton, although there is silence on this from the very early New Testament manuscripts, and makes clear distinction between the God, who is the source of the name, and the Son, the Logos, who is given a unique name and acts in the name of Yahweh. Also, we must remember that for a few centuries, Iao was prevailingly present within the Bible copies read by the dispersed Christian communities, side by side with Hebrew Tetragrammata and the increasingly dominant scribal device of nomina sacra. As a result, a possible consequence is that Iao, or less possible a similar Greek term, might well have appeared in the original New Testament copies as well as in the early Christian kerygma, early Christian witnessing. Also, the earlier view that in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, Jewish scholars used the Greek term Kyrios to render both Adonai and the Tetragrammaton is no longer tenable. Furthermore, the argument that this use was carried over into the Greek New Testament needs to be reevaluated. What about the New Testament? Some bold translators, like, for example, there are many translators. There is a Polish research that has found almost 1,000 different New Testament editions that use a form of the Tetragrammaton. I use here one of them, of Griesinger from 1824, that says, Jehovah sprach zu meinem Herrn. And this is the verse Matthew 22:44. So why he chose to use the name of God instead of the term Herr or Lord? In the most ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, we see the nomen sacrum, Kyrios. Ipen Kyrios to Kyrio mu. Ipen Kyrios to Kyrio mu. This is Sinaiticus Codex and this is Vaticanus Codex. Again, Eusebius, the Christian scholar in the early 4th century, said that the first Kyrios in this verse, in Matthew 22:44, means the name with the 4 letters by the Hebrews. And another term is for the second Lord. The first term, the first Kyrios, means the first God that is among all other things. So it's important to see that even in the 4th century and the centuries that followed, it was clear that it was not a Lord to the Lord who was speaking. It was Jehovah who was speaking to David's Lord. It was Jehovah speaking to his Adonai. If we try, although our time is running out, to find in which stage of the New Testament composition took place this change, we would say that in the original compositions and their finalized forms, every author used whatever he believed that it was best for him to describe his message. He might have used Kyrios for when he was referring to the Father. He may use Jehovah in Hebrew or in a Greek form when he was describing the Father. But in the stages of transmission and translation that followed, we surely can say that the nomina sacra took the priority, and the majority, not the majority, all the manuscripts of the New Testament we have use the nomina sacra. But surely, as we can say, we agree with Conselman that says that Jesus does not know the Jewish fear of pronouncing God's name. He could boldly use the name, although he could make it discreetly when he was to use this name in a time that had already started to be condemned, the public use of the Tetragrammaton. George Howard has an important thesis on this. This is his article about the name of God in the New Testament, and I read the final conclusion. He says that about the New Testament, when the Septuagint, which the New Testament church used and quoted, contained the Hebrew form of the divine name, the New Testament writers no doubt included the Tetragrammaton in their quotations. But when the Hebrew form for the divine name was eliminated in favor of Greek substitutes in the Septuagint, it was eliminated also from the New Testament quotations of the Septuagint. And all the previous we inspected agrees with such a conclusion made with George Howard, despite the fact that we do not have New Testament manuscripts that use the Tetragrammaton within them. It's very interesting that Joseph Priestley, the English chemist, natural philosopher, theologian, and the discoverer of oxygen, of this element, wrote in 1797, "In the Old Testament, let the word Jehovah be rendered by Jehovah, and also the word Kyrios in the New Testament in passages in which there is an allusion to the Old Testament or where it may be proper to distinguish God from Christ." This is a very important rule to remember all the translators of the Greek original. When in the Greek New Testament is the Tetragrammaton, we must discern here, make a distinction among what is an interpretation and what is a translation. When we speak about interpretation, the question is, who is the referent of each Jehovah text? And if we see here, for example, among the other examples, Capes says in the books of Apostle Paul, here there are verses that use the Kyrios, of course, in the Greek text, but God the Father is the referent. Other texts that the Tetragrammaton is used because it's a quotation from the Old Testament, but the Christ is the referent, and allusions to Jehovah texts with Christ as referent as well. So we must discern who is the referent of each case, and very well it is said by Capes again, whether a text is patrologically or Christologically oriented cannot be merely assumed. It has to be worked out through careful readings of the quotations or allusions in context. This is the interpretation level. But what was originally said, for example, by Jesus, or written by in the Gospels or by Paul or other authors in Greek? Of course, there is no way to know. No voice recorders, no autographs available to us today. Probably Christian New Testament manuscripts followed, and the authors, of course, plurality of practices for handling the sacred name that was found in the Jewish Greek Old Testament manuscripts. The role of the Semitic biblical mentality requires to clarify whether Kyrios corresponds to the Tetragrammaton, to the Lord, or to my Lord. So in the Semitic mentality, Hebrew, Aramaic, or Syriac, it should be made clear who is the referent. And we see here a Hebrew translation made in the late 17th century of Matthew 22:44. The Tetragrammaton, Jehovah says to my Adon, to Adonai. του Αντωνή. What is the criteria for identifying Kyrios with the Tetragrammaton? New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures in the Study Edition gives 5 criteria, and they are almost the same with the ones that Bainbridge in a United Bible Society journal, the Bible Translator, used as well. They're almost the same. Is this wording a quote from a verse of the Hebrew scripture that contains the divine name? Is it a Hebrew idiom or an expression that normally includes the divine name? Does the divine name appear in the context surrounding a quotation? Is the definite article missing? Would the divine name have been used in the verse to avoid ambiguity? These are 5 criteria where can help a translator to understand if Jehovah is meant, or just the Lord is meant, or the Lord Jesus is meant. The Greek use of the nomina sacra and of the term Kyrios added or concluded or was the cause of a semantic inadequacy. That is, Kyrios does not make clear in Greek what or who is meant behind it. So, in contrast with the Semitic understanding of the text, the Greek term Kyrios made it difficult to understand. The reverse procedure from the Greek Christian scriptures to the Hebrew text, as the Hebrew translations of the New Testament are making, makes clear, requires this discerning among who is the Lord and who is the Tetragrammaton, Jehovah himself. The using Kyrios caused many implications, or the oon, the existing one from Exodus 3:14. Here we see an icon of the Holy Trinity that uses oon from Exodus 3:14 for the Father, oon for Jesus, and even for the Holy Spirit, the same is used oon. So three who bear the name Jehovah. Also, in strange enough, indeed. Also, translation from the American Bible, an American Bible translation in Romans 10th chapter, Jesus is Jehovah. Really hilarious, we would say. And also Augustine find it difficult to understand how God can be said to be the Lord, master of a slave, that is, as far as God cannot be everlastingly Lord, since the creation he is Lord and is not from everlasting show. So when the Tetragrammaton disappeared from the Holy Bible, many such dogmatic errors appeared. Many mistakes that were due to not understanding the Semitic substratum that was found in the Hebrew scriptures. Here we see some Hebrew New Testament translations from other modern or more older. Also the same, a priest that was responsible for the first 12 books of King James Bible, Richard Clark, made this translation that used in the New Testament the Tetragrammaton. Also Peter Canisius, this Dutch Jesuit who is famous for his catechism, and when it was translated in Greek, we see that the Father is the bearer of the Tetragrammaton. So there were understandings, attempts to understand and identify who is the bearer of the Tetragrammaton in the Bible. In other translations as well, here we see the use of the Tetragrammaton in 1574 in a Polish translation by Simon Budny. In a Cherokee Indian translation of the New Testament by Bible Societies, in a German translation here, we see also in 1829, and here we see a very interesting translation doing the reverse that the Septuagint translation had made. We see here the verse John chapter 1 and verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with Jehovah, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with Jehovah, and so on. So we see here that he replaces the Theos, the God term, with Jehovah, as many times happened by the translations of the Septuagint, but in the reverse order. In modern Greek, we see there are translations, the New World Translation, Trembellas New Testament, Sotiropoulos New Testament, the used forms of the Tetragrammaton, Yehovah or Yahweh, either to denote the Father or to denote that Jesus is also Jehovah as well. Here is the Syriac testimony for the use of the Tetragrammaton. We do not have the time to get into details, but it's very important to see that all the Syriac translations of the Gospels agree, as you can see here in a sample research made the previous year. I made this search in the tradition of the Syriac translations of the Gospel of Matthew. We see that all of them from the 2nd century to the 7th century agree using the term Maria for the Father in all these verses in the Gospel of Matthew, and especially to all the Gospels. It's true the same for all the Gospels, I can say. The case is different in the rest of the books of the New Testament. Also, Syriac fathers, there are many Syriac fathers that say that it's different where is meant the Tetragrammaton in the Hebrew text and where is the Lord meant in the text. Martin Luther also used in his translation of the New Testament, used capital letters for the Herr, for the term Lord, for the Tetragrammaton. He said in the interpretation of Scripture, whoever reads the Bible should also know that I have been careful to write the name of God, which the Jews call the Tetragrammaton, in capital letters. Thus, Lord, Herr, and the second name, which they call Adonai, only half in capital letters. Thus, Lord, with the two first letters in capital. So we see that Martin Luther himself, in his New Testament Bible, make this distinction among who is Jehovah, even not using Jehovah, the term itself. It would be very provocative to use it in his time, because as you see here, other translations made from the Vulgate were using the term Herr, just Lord. It was not easy to make such a change in the translation, in the text of the translation, but he himself did it this way, as happened in the Syriac translations of the New Testament, a special form of the Lord used for the Tetragrammaton, and this is very important. Of course, he said, please do not change this after in my editions. Many took his editions, republished with changes, and do not capitalize these letters to denote the Tetragrammaton. And Luther knew that and said, please do not do that. But after his death, almost all his printers did not follow his pattern of using capitals for the Tetragrammaton in the New Testament, sadly enough. He also, Luther, he says that the use of the Tetragrammaton should be done properly. The name of God has been revealed and given to us for the very purpose that it may be of constant use and profit. We are commanded to employ the name of God for truth and for all good. So we do not curse using the name. We do not revile the name, but we can use the name, as did in the biblical times all the pious, all the faithful people of Israel. Other translations followed this practice used by Martin Luther. For example, these are the first Swedish and Danish Bibles of the New Testament that use capital letters for the Lord, Herrens, Herren, Herrene, for rendering the Tetragrammaton within the New Testament text. And this is very important to remember as well. Other translations, although, for example, in the first edition of the King James Version, there wasn't such a distinction in the New Testament, other early printings of these translations were making this distinction. For example, this 1646 translation of the edition of the King James Version says, "The Lord said to my Lord," the Lord with capitals. Also, the New Living Translation used small capitals, and the Coverdale's Bible, previously translated in 1535 before the King James Version, were also in English used capital letters in the New Testament text. Very important indeed. So what Exodus 3:15 says, it's true. This is my name forever, and this is how I am to be remembered from generation to generation. This was true. The name of God has been remembered from generation to generation by minorities, many centuries, but finally it came to be clear what was the history of this magnificent name. Here is an indicative bibliography that someone would like to read. And this is the end of this presentation.